discussion on Atlantis, aliens, and archaeology. And welcome to the Happy Dog. Thanks for hosting this. So I'm going to turn over the introductions to the people who know themselves the best.
No.
I'm going to be your moderator. I'm Julie. I have a past history with archaeology, and so I'm very interested in this subject. And I'm happy to share this night with you and be your guide as we explore these issues. First, if Paul Edward, if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. I'm Dr. Paul Edward Montgomery Ramírez, so I work at Cleveland State University as an adjunct professor and a NAGPRA compliance officer. I do cultural heritage work, and I am the current speaker of the Indigenous Council for the World Archaeological Congress. I am a Sagittarius. I like long walks by the beach. Yeah, is that what we're looking for?
Sure,
No?
that's wonderful. Could you share a little bit what NAGPRA is?
Oh, right, yeah.
I'm not sure if everyone knows.
NAGPRA is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, wherein any organization that gets money or is affiliated with the United States government is legally, as of 1994, obliged to return ancestral remains of Native American peoples that they have, how to put this nicely, robbed. Unfortunately, there's a large number of institutions that have not complied with this law that they were legally obliged to in 1994, and Ohio is currently the third worst state in the union for NAGPRA compliance. Sorry about that. Ohio couldn't get number one on something. Anyhow.
Thank you for sharing that. Beth, if you could introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, my name is Beth Hoag. I'm an archaeologist. I teach anthropology classes at the Cleveland Institute of Art, which is a weird place maybe to find an archaeologist, but I teach a wide range of classes to undergraduate art students. I've been doing archaeology for, almost 30 years now. I've worked in many places in North America. I've worked in Connecticut, New York State, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, North Carolina, and I spent a lot of my early years in my research career working in Mexico. And today I do local historical archaeology here in Cleveland, and I talk about gender and archaeology a lot.
Hey.
What's your sign?
I'm a Capricorn. I'm a stubborn goat.
Way to go, Capricorn. So am I.
Yeah.
And Amy, would you please share?
Sure. Hi, I'm Amy Margaris. I am a Libra. I teach anthropology and archaeology and museum studies classes at Oberlin College, where I've been for 16 years or so. I'm trained as a prehistorian. I love technology and I study prehistoric technology, but I've been recently drawn into the world of museums because Oberlin, like so many schools in the U.S., used to have an old natural history museum that went by the wayside, but we're left with all of the things. Just because the museum went away doesn't mean all the things didn't, including ancestral remains of Native Americans. So I'm the NAGPRA compliance officer for Oberlin College.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you all being with us here tonight. So, to get us started, I was thinking we would sort of set the context of what we're talking about tonight. A lot of people may hear about Atlantis and archaeological sites, or ancient aliens and archaeological sites, but may not be familiar with the full history. So, let's start with the Atlantean premise. If you could take a shot at explaining to the audience what your understanding of that premise is.
Comes down to Plato, right? I watched some YouTube videos before, in preparation.
And it is genuinely just a metaphor. Yeah. It is a metaphor between the Greeks and the Achaemenids. Like that's kind of what it boils down to. And Plato himself actually says, this isn't real.
Yeah.
Like, he flat out just says, this is not a real thing. And everybody got on board and was like, okay, yeah, thanks, Plato, for telling us this made-up story. And then everyone understood it was a made-up story until about the 1700s, when I guess some really smart people decided that Plato was lying.
Or maybe misunderstood, or I think misinterpreted. Not really clear.
Yeah. And so yeah, they kind of used, the reason why it kind of got back into vogue is, well, scientists were trying to, and scientists, I'm using that term very broadly at this point, were trying to discuss about how there was an entire massive continent filled with people that weren't mentioned in the Bible. And so Atlantis, yeah, they came from the classical world because everything had to come from either the Bible or the classical world.
That's correct.
So that's where it ends up, bringing Atlantis into this story of, oh, hey, that's why Native Americans are here, because Atlantis. Yeah, that makes all the sense in the world.
And not just Native Americans, but in looking at archaeological ruins that were discovered by European settlers, looking at pyramids in Mexico or earthen mounds in Ohio, of which there were at one time thousands in our state. There was a big disconnect between scientists in the 19th and 18th centuries who looked at these enormous earthworks and artifacts associated with them, but felt or saw through their lens a disconnect between something in the past and current indigenous peoples. And so going through science to try to explain that disconnect, that perhaps those were built by some other group of people who were not ancestral to contemporary Native Americans. Lost tribes of Israel, Atlanteans, etc. Something else that fit the narrative. And once that worked its way through science, became ascribed or believed to be true.
Yeah, and it was able to, in removing this entire heritage, this entire length of history from Native people, and if you apply, oh, well, it's Atlanteans, or it's a lost tribe of Israel, or Phoenicians, or Vikings somehow, that you could then transform this entire conversation about, oh, well, Europeans came here first, and then, oh, the people that we know as Native Americans did the killing, so everything that Europeans did back to them is just justice. And sadly, that's kind of a big thing in like the Church of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah.
Like the entire concept of Native Americans are red because they killed good white Israelites, the Lamanites or the Nephites. Which one? Don't remember.
Don't look
which
at me.
one. Oh, sorry
That's
about
new
that.
Been a long time. Yeah. Not history. But yes.
But yeah, basically the idea that it was anyone but the Indians, right, who could have built these really impressive mound structures, civilizations, and so forth.
So, you mentioned the connection with Ohio, and I was wondering if you could elaborate more on how that story about Atlantis played out in specifically in our state, within the archaeology there.
So if I can jump
Yeah,
in,
please.
my mother's side of the family is from near Peebles, Ohio, which is kind of the middle of nowhere, but it's right next to Serpent Mound.
Yeah.
Some of you might have heard of Serpent Mound.
Show of hands, Serpent Mound. Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay.
Not that far. Excellent day trip.
Yeah, so I have what do you call those things to keep the papers from blowing off
A
of your
paperweight?
A paperweight in the shape of Serpent Mound, made by my great uncle, who worked at the little store there. Yeah, right. So it's part of my family history, and you read in history books that Victorian people, Euro-Americans would have picnics on Serpent Mound, and my mother did that. She would have Sunday picnics on Serpent Mound. one of many effigy mounds, but part of a much larger complex throughout the eastern United States of mounds built by various Native American groups we now understand. But you know, it fits into this question of who built these mounds. Again, anyone but the Native Americans. This idea was just to help to justify Euro-American expansion out of when Ohio was the Wild West, further and further west, driving Native Americans onto reservations and so forth. And
Ohio was the very first Indian reserve, but just officially the very first Indian reserve in the continent. Just yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Serpent's Mound. Having lunch at Serpent's Mound.
Having lunch atop the mound was a fun thing to do.
Yeah.
Well, and there have also, I was doing a little bit of research into kind of get my understanding correct. There have also been in Ohio a number of archaeological hoaxes perpetuated and discovered that continued that story. If you permit me to look at my notes, probably the most well-known here, and there have been a number of these archaeological hoaxes, again, designed to push a false narrative of anyone but Native Americans, right? Have you heard of the Cardiff Giant from New York State? Anybody know the Cardiff Giant, right? You can go to Cooperstown Farmers Museum today and see one of the replicas, because there's a whole story about a replica, fake replica. But anyway, there were a number of these, right? And they were made and perpetuated by people who wanted to further that story, right? So the Newark Holy Stones were a collection of objects that were discovered in, look at my notes here, about 1860. They were allegedly discovered in a Native American burial mound with other human remains, but they were carved in a way that looked like they were European. They looked like they had Hebrew lettering on them. And European kind of biblical stories, again, that attempt to, if not Atlantis, at least tie a European and a Christian or biblical connection to the peoples, the prehistoric peoples of the Americas. And these were believed for a long time to be true. And in looking at why would someone go to all the trouble of creating these objects, making up fake Hebrew letters, putting them on these documents and then, or on these objects and then passing them off as real. And to quote a colleague of ours, Jeb Cardew, who's written about this, if these stones were genuine, they would provide a definitive answer to the most consequential question of the 19th century American science, religion, and politics. The question of which the so-called human races was truly human, and more immediately was consequential to that. Like how do these indigenous people relate to our understanding of ideas of race and eugenics and all of that? Right? So there have been hoaxes perpetuated here, and those kinds of stories, again, seeking to divorce indigenous people today of their history. Good question.
The one problem with those stones was they were written in modern Hebrew.
Right, and that was it. If you've done a little bit of looking at it.
Was it a dentist who did it?
Yeah,
He was a
so,
dentist, I think.
but many of these objects, there are a whole collection of these kinds of things, not just from Ohio, there are some from Iowa and
all
other
over.
places, right, that either say that they have Greek lettering or Hebrew lettering or something else, right?
Yeah, I'm working on one about in Oklahoma, some a rune stone in Oklahoma that tries to make it like, oh yeah, the Vikings came up the Mississippi and then up a creek into Oklahoma, and then just casually decided to write in big ass letters Valley of the Gnomes for some reason, which that wasn't even, gnome wasn't even a word until the 1700s. So anyhow, but yeah, I think so. This myth is, it's called the myth of the mound builders, and that's this. And sometimes we still archaeologically use the term mound builder because, yeah, we don't know precisely what modern nations would have done it, because people change over thousands of years, and so it's likely a lot of different people participated in this. So we can't just kind of like focus and say, oh yeah, it's the Osage who did that. We couldn't say something like that. So we still kind of use this term, the mound builders. But in the 17 and 1800s, that meant something really different. The very first edition of the Smithsonian Journal actually had an article by Ephraim Squire, which has a really weird connection with me too, because he wrote about these mounds in Ohio and talked about them as either being from a advanced European people. Of course, when he says European, he means white. Large white people made this and then got themselves killed by those horrible, horrible, savage natives. Or not natives, as it ends up being in this story. And so archaeologically, we use some weird terms. You'll hear a lot of these places, they're called earthworks. Well, an earthwork is a fortification for a fort, for military. And even into these original concepts, understandings of what exactly people were seeing, they placed, and these are archaeologists, are placing this idea of their own cultural supremacy over the land. And so Ephraim Squire, he wrote about these mounds in Ohio and published it through the Smithsonian, the very first journal by the Smithsonian Institute, published his work. And this was at the same time when he was also going through my home country in Nicaragua, of like saying, oh yeah, look at all this cool stuff that they did, and how can we build a canal through it? So, you know, in two ways this dude shows up in my life. And so this connection of either some kind of an Atlantis or a lost civilization, because we can stretch it out a little bit more broadly as not necessarily, Atlantis is just kind of a placeholder. Even, you know, those hacks like Graham Hancock, they'll make some kind of a placeholder. They'll say, oh, I'm not necessarily talking about, you know, specifically Atlantis, but I mean Atlantis. So it's just this idea of a lost civilization that ceased to exist, typically through imagined violence, because it's reflective of the violence that settlers did onto native people when they showed up. And so the idea was that, of course, everyone does that to everybody, because if that's not what people do to each other, then maybe we're the bad guys here.
So, how does, in more recent times, there's now this story of the ancient aliens supplanting the Atlanteans, or that placeholder. How does that relate to these stories?
Ooh, okay, so can I? Because I love this. Oh my goodness, oh man. So this actually isn't really that new into the story. So we have a woman by the name of Madame Blavatsky, who founded the School of Theosophy, which still exists, and I think its headquarters are in New York today. Anyhow, so one of the concepts that she had is these different cosmic root races that show up in Earth over like a span of like, I don't know, her understanding of like how old the Earth was is really interesting, because it's like nearly a trillion years is her understanding. And so there are these 4 root races that occupied Earth. Some of them came from elsewhere, and some of them have been influenced by cosmic entities, including these like psychic Antarctic jellyfish people. That was one of the root races that she decided existed. And so the 4th root race is apparently the one that we humans come from. But she divided that up into different branches of the root races, wherein only specifically one of those branches of the human root race can continue to evolve. Everyone else is a biological dead end. So that goes like people from Africa are the first most flawed version. And then East Asian people from South Asia, and she ends up having the Atlanteans. The Atlanteans came into this scene as the third stem from this root race, and they destroyed each other in like the most cyberpunk way you could possibly think of. Like they're going in these like badass steamships and stuff, just burning each other alive. And then suddenly there are these priests of this group that are like, oh no, this is bad. And because they realized it, their skin became white, and they were the ones that are allowed to evolve. Meanwhile, the ones that weren't allowed to evolve are the Native Americans and Polynesians in this weird space opera of a story. And so this is in the 1800s. And so yeah, it just kind of spins into a like really, really gross, actively racist story, because only those Atlanteans that understood that their weird steampunk genocides were bad, they became the Aryans. Yay, that's not a loaded term to use ever. And those folks are the only humans that will then be able to evolve into the cosmic entities that we're supposed to be. So it's got a really long brand. I love the jellyfish, honestly.
Yeah, let's take it on that. Well, and then, yeah, did you have a question?
Yes, specifically in the ancient.
Could we hold the questions until a little bit later?
Oh, okay.
No worries.
Now, there's going to be a section for questions, I promise.
Just hang on to that question.
This idea of the Atlanteans permeates, for a long period of time, and most recently, and you referred to Graham Hancock, and who's the protagonist of the Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse. How do modern day individuals who hold these beliefs justify their claims?
That's a hard one. I feel like, I'll go just another. I feel like, and I think about this a lot, perhaps with the internet and the availability of information, I feel like sometimes people just say, I saw that and I believe it and it makes sense to me. Like it doesn't seem like it even needs a lot of inquiry anymore to assign an alien origin or an Atlantean origin to something, because it fits a personal belief that can be validated easily by nefarious or dubious websites and groups. I don't know. I think about that. What do you think, Amy?
So I teach an introduction to archaeology class every fall, and I talk about this stuff a little bit, and my students tend to know these shows like Ancient Aliens, but I have to admit I never saw them until today. So I did some homework, and I watched.
I couldn't bring myself to watch it.
It's painful.
I hate myself so much that I will watch it.
It's painful. I watched some snippets of Ancient Aliens, Top 4 Mysteries of Atlantis, on YouTube, and so I made some observations, having never seen this before. And something that I thought was really interesting was that the narrators and all the interviewees were very clearly conflating the gods with extraterrestrials.
Oh yeah.
And I thought this was really, really interesting because, I'm not saying there are extraterrestrials. I don't know, there's lots of things we don't know in the universe, right? But, many people believe in God, but there's this conflation between, your spirituality, perhaps your religion, a very short step between that and aliens as this sort of superior form that we don't really understand that influenced human behavior. So to me, that seemed like a very clever intellectual shortcut to draw a lot of people in from their natural sense of maybe wonderment about the universe and curiosity about our past. Just a short step from that to like E.T. built the pyramids.
Well, and also I think it makes an easy way to explain something that you look at and as someone that perhaps is not steeped in Egyptian archaeology, how did they build the pyramids? It seems like a really complicated thing, and we can't fathom how we might do that today. I have no idea how I would build a pyramid. It is, again, I think an easy step to say perhaps it was inspired by something divine or out of this world, because we can't project the talents and abilities of people in the past, I think.
Yeah, and again, this to bring this into how we talk about things like UFOs and alien abductions and things like that, that actually has a very strong fit in with a thousands of year old tradition of other worlders. So like things that we would call like fairies and shit like that. Those are re-narrated into, because, you know, if you come into, say, an atomic world and you're talking about demons and fairies and stuff, people are going to be like, I don't know about that, buddy. But if suddenly you can reinterpret it in a kind of a quasi-scientific way, then that can vindicate the same exact story that you're trying to tell. I have an article coming out on Mothman. You know, hands up for Mothman, yeah? Woo! And Mothman fits in with all of these narratives of space aliens, of other worlders, demons, and of this mound builder myth. That all of this has this ability to intersect into this very cozy and really cool narrative. Because I mean, Mothman's real fun, and people like to have their stories containable. Meanwhile, the story of human experience is anything but containable. We have too many stories because every single one of us in this room understands our world as being a very different thing. So, you know, if there are billions of people with different experiences and understandings, then that makes things really complicated.
Can I build on that for a minute?
Oh, sure, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to add something to that, which is a little bit of a story. People love stories, right? So I had a colleague once who is not my colleague any longer, was a historian, and he said to me once, you know, you archaeologists are really bad at storytelling.
Sometimes, yeah.
And it hurt my feelings. He's totally right. He's totally right. But on the other hand, historians are good at spinning a yarn. And when you tell a story, you're putting something of yourself in there in ways that have not always been explicit in history. So archaeology, I would like to say that we have learned from mistakes of the past. And when we tend to stick very closely to the data, we're not as good at telling the big stories because it's so easy to tell the wrong story. A story that is rooted only in your own experience, one that might be intentionally or not a racist story or whatever. You had to put your own slant on it. So we tend to stick very closely to the data. And so getting back to your original question about these shows like Ancient Aliens, if you look carefully, you'll notice there's no data. There are only stories.
It's just conjecture. And then, yes, my conjecture, obviously.
Yeah, and it's fun. It's fun stuff.
Yeah, and if you have a little bit of a credential behind your name, even if it's not in the field, it sounds like I could be telling the right story, right? I could be telling the truth, and we can spin that with a little bit of, we're not entirely sure, but here's my fantastical story I'm going to share with you, right? It becomes intoxicating.
A lot more fun than real archaeology.
Yeah, which is so much like, I don't know.
There's some dirt and some rocks, right? It's more fun than that.
We look at poop a lot, guys.
Do we?
I mean,
Okay.
yes.
Or garbage dumps.
I may have excavated a privy or two, yes.
So that brings me to my next question about how do we understand and critique or counter these kinds of stories that we've been hearing. One example that is I studied the ancient Maya and the ancient Aztec, and one story that I know is there's this tomb in Mexico. The king whose tomb it is called Pakal the Great, but it looks like he's falling, and there's like a turtle, or what is supposed to be a turtle?
An earth monster.
An earth monster, yeah. And that is often touted as an ancient astronaut symbol. So, like, how would you counter someone who brought you that tomb picture, the picture of that tomb carving, and said, here is a proof of an ancient astronaut? Like, how would you counter those arguments?
I think it depends on who the person is, because not everybody gets into or gets attached to these ideas in the same way. Some people are very much looking for I don't want to say this in kind of a bad way, but like a scientific and atheistic approach to the world, that there are no gods, there's just something that's masquerading that way. And there are people who approach it that way, and that's when you were talking about, they're talking about gods, is because, gods don't exist, but there are stories, so there must be something there. So you just kind of have to look at who the person is, where they're coming from, and obviously don't be a dick to them about engaging, because a lot of people who get into these, obviously they're interested in the past. They are interested in learning and knowing things. But yes, I'm trying to be generous here.
Dude, this book, Chariots of the Gods, which is the famous book that launched 1,000
it
bad
just
myths,
so happened
1,000 terrible
to be the
stories.
successful one.
Yeah. I loved this book. In middle school, I read this book so many times.
And what's it say on the back? Did spacemen visit Earth
No.
thousands of years
Well,
ago?
I
Now
love-
we have proof.
Well, I love how the title of the book has a question mark in it. Yeah, Chariot of the Gods.
But I got a great education, right? I went to college, I learned these critical thinking skills, and so the curiosity that brought me in, or the curiosity that made me interested in the artifacts that came from Serpent Mound, where my family was from, were just the starting place. And then I was able to be with an intellectual community and build on that curiosity with the addition of data. But not everybody has that advantage. So I totally agree with you that often the people who are interested in this stuff are like potential allies. We just need to have conversations with them.
No, I'm sorry.
I said two things. Something that I teach in my classes beyond this topic is, how do we navigate science? How do we know what data is? How do you read something and evaluate, is this believable? Is this backed by science? Frequent saying of mine, that's not how science works, right? How do we understand scientific inquiry and what these kinds of things mean? I have a friend of my, actually a distant family member of my partner, who posts a lot of conspiracy theory things on Facebook, and I kind of like to watch it just to keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on in the world around. And they had posted a picture of Stonehenge, I think a black and white photo that was taken, I want to say in the 20s, when the English Heritage Trust had done some restoration work there, and they were writing back up some of the trilithons. And this picture, the title underneath it was proof that Stonehenge isn't real, that it was made up in the 20th century by the British. And I thought, well, I'm an archaeologist, this is right up my alley. I'm going to take a stab at debunking this. And so I did a quick moment worth of research and said, yes, that photo without its context is meaningless. That context was, they weren't building it from scratch, right? They were writing it up. And if we go back, we can look at accounts in medieval time of Stonehenge standing up. The Romans wrote about Stonehenge 2,000 years ago. And so I crafted that into a nice, friendly little statement. I said, well, I'm an archaeologist, and here's what I can tell you about that photograph. And they kind of acquiesced and said, all right, fine. but the moon landing was still faked.
You believe in the moon?
So, we go so far, right? And, sometimes it
Yeah.
feels like you're trying to put out a little teeny fire here and everything else is blazing. But, bit by bit in pointing out how we can evaluate information and make decisions about what we see around us.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to, when you engage with people, is there's a certain point in what is it called? It's where you are presented with enough information that really just screws with your entire worldview, and your brain just kind of like resets. Anyhow, it's a phenomenon that I know, I'm blanking on it right now. Where cognitive dissonance. Thank you so much. Where if somebody's presented with too much information that conflicts with their established understanding and view of the world, their brain's going to be like, no, don't do this. We can't have this. And they'll just shut it out. They'll just reject the information. So you kind of have to, and I remember having this conversation with a very, very lovely gentleman who he very firmly believed in the lost continent of Mu. Because there are 3 big lost continents apparently. Atlantis, Lemuria, and Mu. Lemuria was used to explain continental drift before continental drift existed. And Mu was to explain how there were Polynesians all over the Pacific. And so off the coast of Okinawa, there are some stone features that they look pretty angular and well hefted, well constructed. But if you understand like a tiny, tiny bit of how plate tectonics, volcanism work, you absolutely understand, oh yeah, that is just a shitload of pressure that was put on these rocks, and they all broke in the same way. But to another person who doesn't know about that, yeah, that looks like somebody carved all of it. And then, yeah, I guess it sank into the ocean. So this person that I was talking to, they were very adamant about, oh yeah, that's evidence of this lost continent, this sunken continent. And so as I was explaining plate tectonics and explaining volcanism in the Ring of Fire, the most charged place in the world for volcanism, at some point I just saw his eyes just glaze over, and he just like blinked a bit, shook his head, and he's like, no, that's not what that is. Like, oh my dude, I just talked at you for 30 minutes.
So, understanding, there seems to be a line of critical thinking and education that helps with discerning the fact from the fiction. How do you help, or what advice would you give to individuals who may not have, for a variety of structural reasons, access to the kinds of educational systems or the kinds of information that would allow them to make those discernments, such as your friend? And what advice would you give to like the general public who may never have taken an archaeology class to help them kind of be critical when watching these programs?
One of the things that I noticed watching and taking a look at the team watching this on YouTube today was that there's no cultural context. So it's just skipping around from, this person says this about Atlanteans when it's like Antarctica, this person says this about Plato, and the dots are very widely scattered without any consideration of the context of any one particular culture. So the example that you mentioned about Palenque and Mexico, like, read a little bit about Mexico, read a little bit about the Maya, and then if you're looking at this inscription, it's not just you from the outside bringing your interpretations to a drawing or an inscription. You're thinking about what is the context of the people who made and reacted to this inscription. Just a little bit of knowledge about the society in question can go a long way.
It's a hard one though too, because I think sometimes it's hard to discern what is a reputable source, right? We know, we could point you easily in the direction of a dozen or more really good books if you wanted to know something about our specialty, right? But if you didn't know that, you might think that the Chariots of the Gods was a valuable piece of literature. It's in the library. You can buy it at the used bookstore, right? I think sometimes it can be really hard to discern that. I encourage anybody to think those through, and you can't always say, kind of the Occam razor approach, like the most straightforward interpretation.
Oh yeah, that
is
doesn't
easiest
work
because
here.
then I say, well, that's aliens. That's the easiest one. Duh, we're done here. And so it's really complicated.
Yeah.
And especially as some of those topics around science become politicized, it becomes even more complicated, I think, to be able to have those conversations and help point people in the right direction sometimes.
Yeah. And I think there are a lot of problems that we are facing. So even, I think obviously one of the first and biggest problems is that archaeologists and academics really do a shitty job of engagement sometimes. Not all of us, and lots of us are trying real hard.
Here we are.
Right, yeah. But as a discipline, we use a lot of words that aren't really easy for people. There is so much in our writing, in our work, that if it's not behind a incredibly horrific paywall for all y'all, which I should say there is things called like LibGen. You can go onto that. It's Library Genesis. You can go and you can sail the 7 seas and find free academic work from that. That's otherwise behind a paywall. That, if you want to read this article, that's $150. I just published a chapter in a book, and the book costs $160. How is that useful for people other than in our position? And so that in itself is a massive problem, is access. And not just free, but access to where the work that's being put out has people who are not specialists in mind is a massive academic failing that we have and still have. And that's in the end, the Von Danigens and all of those hucksters, all of those grifters are more than happy to take your money because they can tell you a cheap story that sounds really, really good, and it's far more accessible than what very often we are able to do. But then in the same sense, when we're engaging with pseudo-archaeologies, with conspiracy theories, those things are never ending. And it doesn't matter how many times we say, no, wait, that thing's not a thing. It then just moves. It's like, oh, well, then what about this thing? It's like, oh, okay, that's not a thing either. And it becomes a continued cycle. So there are a lot of things that are at play, and it's, partially academia's fault, because, that long history of not thinking that the plebs deserve to know anything is still there. And even when it's not there, it's still a view that people like Graham Hancock say, is that, those, what did he call, like, big archaeology that we're covering up giants. It's like, please, if there was an archaeologist who saw a damn giant, they would go to the bar that night and tell literally everyone.
We couldn't keep a secret like that. Wow. Yeah. That's such a good point.
All right, so now is the time for questions from the audience. Anyone have any questions?
Oh, this gentleman did.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That dude had.
Can we just, like, we're here to debunk this guy Graham, but maybe you could throw out a couple examples besides Atlantis. Like, specifically, they talk about this stone obelisk is so hard, only advanced tools, modern tools could cut this.
That's a great. So a lot of the times, these, I think you're talking about that massive obelisk
can you
that
repeat the
in
question?
Egypt that wasn't.
Can you repeat the question so they
sorry.
can hear?
So,
Or you
they-
can-
Oh yeah, sorry.
We'll repeat
So
it.
the question was, these a kind of a more specific example is that there's an obelisk in, I think if we're thinking about the same one, in Egypt that wasn't actually kind of finished. There's no way that the technology of the time could have cut as hard of a material as that obelisk is made out of. And that's kind of, that argument of lack of technology is almost invariably brought into play. And the thing with that is, that argument always fails to understand that people have always been smart as hell and committed. So that those basalt obelisks, you couldn't cut that with a stone tool, and they absolutely weren't. They were cut with sand. Sand was put into a small groove that was able to be made and just pressed through and used and slowly ground through. And that's not a sexy story, but that is one of like, God damn, those people were committed. They were so into what they were doing. And then in some senses, there are, those stones in like Tiwanaku and in the Andes that, you can't, there's such a tiny space that not even a piece of paper could go through those. And that idea then, there was a recent paper that came out that finally looked at what Quechua people said about how those stones got there. And they said, the elders turned the stones into liquid. And so previous archaeologists were like, nah, you guys are just a bunch of dumb Indians. That doesn't mean anything. Until they kind of looked at a chemical analysis and were like, oh, that's cement. They made cement, local cement. I guess their story was right. So there are these things at play where we have this idea of human progression that people somehow, before our modern time, before giant machines and shit, that we were somehow really, really dumb and couldn't do things. But that's never, ever actually been the case. And the more you learn about things, that story of human capacity, that story of the ability to work together, to cooperate, and to come to some kind of a solution, that is the human story, which I think is so incredibly important for us to recognize that, this ancient alien stuff really doesn't even pretend that is a part of us. It really takes away from who we are and who we've always been by saying, we couldn't do things before the Industrial Revolution. That's just nonsense. Yeah, it took a lot of effort, but we've always been up to those kinds of challenges as people.
This gentleman in the center.
You brought up the book, Charity to the God.
Cheer to the gods.
I read that in 1968, and it's still selling.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
willing to say that that sold more books than any other legitimate archaeology book ever written.
Yes.
You're probably right.
And it's not, you keep talking about the teachers not doing a good job. It's not the teachers. People are stupid. They want to be in this class.
Well, I don't know if I'd say
No.
people are stupid as much as it's accessible, it's readable, and you know, like me picking up a book on physics that was, you know, like pseudo-physics. I have no idea. I could read something and believe it because it set up a good argument and it was compelling.
Yeah. And it's an easier read than Colin Renfrew's book, Archaeology.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Oh yeah.
So much easier.
I mean, some people are stupid, but
Yeah.
I don't think that's the biggest explanation.
It's always a few.
All right. Next question. The gentleman in the black jacket. Yeah. Yes.
I guess,
Hold on here.
really push
Maybe.
back. I think that, you know, we can talk about ancient history without the mysteries of ancient history without invoking aliens and things like that.
Absolutely.
I grew up with, and I still own the book, History Begins with Sumer. And it didn't begin with Sumer, and we thought it did until we found something before. Clovis first was the paradigm for so long.
And Clovis doesn't exist.
But the thing was, so many people that said, well, wait a minute, I think that there might be more here, not necessarily white people, clearly Native American, that were here before Clovis, or Clovis was here before the time we got here, and now it's been disproven. So I mean, I think that, you know, we can have, I think at least for me, I was a minor in archaeology. I think there is an argument for saying that this is what we know so far, not this is the way it is.
Yeah.
And quite often, and I get this when I go to these panels, there is this, we know it, this is what it is, this is how long we've been here, and that's it. And it's like, until we find out, we've been here 1,000 years before that.
And-
So I just kind of wanted to push back.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I completely appreciate that because a lot of the work that I do a lot of work with indigenous rights, and I mean, obviously, I'm not alone on that. But yeah, that entire idea though of Clovis first is also, we have to understand that archaeologists also come from a set of biases. Nobody is beyond that. I mean, Ephraim Squire, racist as hell as he was a very well-respected archaeologist. He had his biases, and we understand that now. And the model of Clovis first fit into a model of the peopling of the Americas that isn't real. It never was real, and it's racist as shit. But we found a alleged model of a tool industry. So like these stone tools called Clovis, we call Clovis based on a site that was found in the 1920s in New Mexico,
Yeah.
yeah. And said, oh yeah, everything at this time looks vaguely like this. So yeah, that's one single culture, one single tool industry, and we haven't found anything before that. I mean, we have, until we did, and
But if I may, if
Yeah.
you could just tell, everyone here, because this is what we all learned in school,
Right.
was that the Native Americans came
Yeah.
across the ice bridge
Right.
13,000
Yeah.
years ago, and
So-
and they're still teaching that.
absolutely, no,
And
yeah,
and
it's
they're still
it's
teaching
real
kids.
bad.
And
So
it's like,
I was,
no, they were here before that.
yeah, so
I
I
think
was,
you make a really good point
Yeah.
that I don't think that scientists themselves do a good enough job of indicating what the scientific method is to the public. The idea that just because science says something is true, it doesn't mean it's true. It means this is our working idea until we get more evidence.
well, see, but we even,
That we move forward, and so the statements that we make should be made with humility and understanding that tomorrow there might be a different story.
Right? That's how science works. That's what I tell my students, right? We can talk in absolutes about some things, like these ideas of kind of conspiracy theory archaeology doesn't work, right? But I think one thing, you're correct, that I don't think always comes out from our field is we make the best assumptions we can with what we have at this moment, and we will find a discovery about something tomorrow that will completely change our paradigm.
Yeah.
Right? And to understand that it's okay for science to be wrong, for us to admit that we misinterpreted, or a new bit of information completely changes the way we think about things. And I think, right, and when that story is missed, and then we end up with that story in K-12 of people have been on this continent for 10,000 years, they come to my classes or perhaps your classes, and we tell them otherwise, and our undergraduates at any rate will tell us this is the first time we've heard this kind of information.
Yeah.
We
And I
continue to reiterate that we change our minds, and that's okay.
And I think it's also really important to recognize specifically in this case that concept of the land bridge. So the way that that's described is that the peopling of the Americas, it's the same way that animals come into any habitat. So when we talk about people who would be, Europeans or what, because that's not a real thing, but whatever, just for that argument, the people who would come into the area known as Europe and subsequent groups of people, they're coming in on like horseback, with chariots, with farming. They're coming in on boats as adventurers. But for Native Americans, they're coming in like animals do. And that story strikes so hard with how people who are settlers to the Americas, how that can vindicate their existence here. Because the argument, the model that we actually scientifically understand and have understood for decades, let me be clear, this isn't new archaeology on that. We had what's the site down in the tip of South America. That's
Montgomery.
Is depending on some of the dating, you could say, yeah, that's 36,000 years ago. There are sites in Brazil that are being dated to about 30 or 40,000 years ago.
How about Meadowcroft, 2 hours from here?
Oh yeah,
right?
Go there, 19,000 years ago.
At
Meadowcroft
least.
Stone Shelter in Pennsylvania. You can go there, which flat out says to exactly, people were in what is Pennsylvania today 19,000 years ago. So our understanding archaeologically and scientifically has been that people were absolutely here tens of thousands of years before what we socially like to say, because it's politically and socially expedient to pretend that Native people, that we haven't been here for as long as we are, despite the fact all the evidence in the world points to no earlier, what the recent one was 24,000 years ago. So, yeah, people were coming here on ships or boats, whatever, however you want to say it, been coming on boats for tens of thousands of years. That's not the same story of, oh, they came here following meat like a bunch of wolves. Those are two really different understandings of how people came here. And one is very inhuman, and the other shows that people have and always are clever. We are adventurous, and we make risks, calculated risks that, then that's just a part of the human spirit. But, if it's Native people, we can't be that, because then that makes it like, well, we're just as human as the rest of people. So.
One more thing I was going to say, but just to that point though, based on what you just said, I hope you can understand how for many people, the invoking Atlantis, it does become a catch-all for just saying there was something before, there was more before. It's not about crystals and flying cars and all kinds of woo-woo. No, it's just saying, hey, civilization, i.e. it could be Native American, whatever, on many of these continents, goes back further than we were initially told.
Yeah, absolutely. But then we can't put them, mush them together, is then the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
This gentleman over here?
I get the sense that your speakers don't regard the chariots of the gods as being a reputable resource.
Correct.
Do you recommend to the audience that they might want to read Carl Sagan's A Demon Haunted World?
So the question is, would the speakers recommend Carl Sagan's book? What was it called again?
A Demon Haunted World.
A Demon Haunted World,
Talks about rationality.
which talks about rationality. And I guess as an extension, what would you recommend that our audience read?
Wow. I don't know that book, so I can't
Read it all.
Yeah, I mean, I would always say to do a broad amount of reading, but I think one of the problems that we do end up facing is that a person can be an incredibly well-educated figure in one discipline and not know anything in something else. So if you're going to read something that's about archaeology, maybe an archaeologist, maybe them.
I have two suggestions in particular if you're interested in learning more about pseudo-archaeology and pseudoscience, right? One of them I brought tonight, a book called Frauds, Myths, and Mystery by Ken Fetter.
Right.
He has several editions now, and you can pick up a used copy of this at used bookstores for relatively inexpensive. Fraud, Myths, and Mysteries.
Yeah.
And the other book,
Misanthropy.
and an archaeologist in Ohio named Jeb Card wrote a book called Spooky Archaeology that also debunks and kind of looks at the history of these. And there's one more by Augustine Fuentes. Do you know the book?
Yeah.
I'll Google it in a minute and I'll share that. So those are really good places that those authors all take a number of topics and they talk about why this is pseudoscience, what we know about it, and why it's problematic. And in Ken Feder's case, here's some alternative readings by archaeologists and other places to get the true story. So I'm not paid by them to plug that. Those are really valuable resources that I found that are easily accessible, and I think they're very readable. They are written for a general audience, unlike some of our more jargon-laden books. Spooky Archaeology by Card, C-A-R-D.
Yeah, and who wrote Misanthropology just came out maybe late last year. Oh, I don't remember who wrote that, but it's I think it's Routledge, and Misanthropology is the name of the book.
A couple years ago. I know, right?
Yes. So you're proposing this issue on this knowledge gap between people in the field and lay audience, especially considering the average person's short attention span and average reading level of a sixth grader. What do you propose as a solution to this in getting this information out to lay audience?
The question is, given the average person's reading level and short attention span, how do we bridge the knowledge gap between the experts and the general public?
There's a great website called Sapiens. It's like an online newsletter with short little articles, bite-sized, okay for Gen Z or whatever is happening
All
now.
of us. It's great.
Yeah. Written by biological anthropologists, articles by archaeologists. Sapiens. It's awesome. Written by real anthropologists, but in an accessible way. Read that. Just look at Sapiens.
I concur.
And when in doubt, look at a .org and not a .com on the internet, and forget TikTok and all that bull. Just don't do that.
I found the other book that I mentioned by Augustine Fuentes is called Race, Monogamy, and Other Lies They Told You, Busting Myths About Human Behavior. That was published in 2012, but I think he might have a second edition, and it looks like a really great one. So Fuentes, Race, Monogamy, and Other Lies They Told You.
Yeah.
And that website was Sapiens again for
Excuse
those
us, guys.
who are
Sorry.
listening.
Sorry.
And yeah, I mean, and I think, not people don't necessarily have a short attention span. If they're interested in something, they got more time for it. And I mean, yeah, there is a lot of onus on folks who are in archaeology and who are doing the work to absolutely every one of us should be engaging. I respect that, not every academic has social skills, but we need to reflect on the work that we're doing and how it actually impacts. So like one of the things that I am is a public archaeologist, where all of the work that I do is under the understanding that no amount of archaeological research or work is neutral. Nothing about the human story and our understanding of it is neutral. And some archaeologists, some historians, some humanities folk like to pretend it is, but it's not. And so there's that gap that we have to come at the layperson and work with all of you. Because if people are walking away from a conversation with an archaeologist and maybe they'll be more confused, or like having a real bad understanding of the world and knowledge as we know it, then we failed. We did. If we can't impart something in even a tiny little nuanced way, like just a little kernel of knowledge and understanding, that can grow into a fucking tree. And that is important, because learning isn't just one little bit, it's forever.
All right, we have time for 2 more questions. Yeah?
Hi, amateur historian / high strangeness nerd. So there was the conversation you guys were having earlier about how Europeans love to like whitewash in order to understand, and there was a phrase you said that like aliens were considered gods by Mesolithic or Paleolithic. But then that also, I drew the parallel. I was listening to a podcast about La Malinche, the queen, the Cortez's mistress.
Malinche, yeah.
Yeah. And they were talking about how when the conquistadors made land, they say the natives thought, oh my God,
Which
they're
isn't
gods.
true at all.
Which isn't true. They
Not
look
even
like
slightly true.
animals. But it was also that thought of, are they a god? So like, I kind of want to hear you guys draw the parallel between this whole new creature. Is it a god? Is it an ancient alien?
So okay,
conquistadors?
so that story of thinking that Hernan Cortez was a god isn't true.
Yeah. But
Like,
a person on a horse looked like crazy.
Sure.
They thought it was one animal.
Well, no, not necessarily. They were like, why the hell are these people riding deer?
Oh, okay.
And that was what was terrifying. Is like, why are you doing that? That is really absurd. That and like, yeah, horses are, if a bunch of them are clanging on metal and stuff, it's like, oh man, that's really wonky. I don't know what's going on. But yeah, so it's actually a much later understanding and retelling of the story that says, oh, they thought he was a god. It's like, no, they didn't. They were like, oh, hey, these dumb hairy barbarians just came across, because like universally, that seems to be a universal thing, is like native people, like Europeans show up and native people are like, oh, those are gross, diseased, hairy people.
They were
what
not
are they
impressed.
do? No, not at all.
The Moctezuma was fairly certain that he could kill them all, and he probably almost did, but he felt he was superior. He knew he was.
Yeah.
Those stories become twisted to kind of explain away why the conquest happened, or perhaps to rationalize it. Say, well, of course, Europeans subdued indigenous peoples because they thought they were God, and it changes the narrative there. And it's
No, we're doing with aliens
it's
now.
not everybody's got xenophobia. It's not just
Oh no, absolutely, and that's the thing. No, and somebody just said about smallpox, and one of the things we have to recognize up until like the concept of modern rifling, whenever Europeans and Native Americans actually went to fisticuffs, unless that native society had already been ravaged by some kind of disease, the Europeans always got their asses handed to them, just across the board. Like that's how it was. And of course, you know, obviously the Spanish and the English would not say that was the case, but even when we look at, so if we want to look at Pontiac's War, for example, around these parts, just how different Native people treated diplomacy than how Europeans did, and how the concept of warfare, just two very different ideas of warfare. So Pontiac's War from 1763 to 1765, which was waged around here. At the end of that war, at the conclusion of that war, the Confederacy that Pontiac was leading, they gave some concessions in their in this treaty with the English colonists, because the entire reason to coming to the table to make a treaty is that both sides needed something, and if both sides didn't get something that they needed, then you'd go to war again. So from a European understanding, a Western understanding of how treaties and war happens, that, oh, if you concede, you've lost. But from how Eastern Woodlands people saw it, it's like, well, no, we might have won, but we want peace. So we want something, and we're gonna give you something, so that way we can have peace. Which then, you know, didn't work out, because then it's like, oh, you gave this time, so.
All right, we have time for one more question. Gentleman back there.
So since I got a panel of professors, I'm a master's candidate. I'm a master's candidate. It's a research question. I think you were touching on it. I missed what.
Okay.
So, when I'm researching, I come across a scholarly article or something that they give you a blurb and then it's locked. So libgen
dot whatever. Go into a search engine and find that. It'll be, because it's on part of the spicy internet. You can go through, and what people do, so there's like libgen, there's Sci-Hub, go through.
Which we didn't say.
I don't care, I will condone that.
It's pretty great, but
yeah.
to be clear.
I won't tell anybody.
It's a thing that exists that people can use to go and find books, find articles that are behind paywalls, and there is an incredible amount of information that is made free to everyone.
I'll also point out, if you are a master's candidate, probably through your library, university website, you probably have a lot of access. I've been really impressed over the last maybe just 3 or 4 years about the amount of open access research that is available. And if you're not associated with a university or college library, quite a lot of it is available through both the Cleveland Public Library and the Cuyahoga Public
absolutely.
Library if you have a library card.
Yeah.
Things like Ohio and other places that have begun opening up massive amounts of journal articles and books and places where you can now get at them through a paywall. And if you can't get it, then you ask the librarian, can you help me get this research?
Yeah.
Right? Open pedagogy is really going to change how we can access these kinds of readings in the future.
Yeah, and I have not met an academic who, if you're like, hey, I'd like to read your article, but it's behind a paywall, I have never met someone who would be like, oh, well, you can go kick stones.
Yeah.
We will get you an article if you ask us for it. Obviously, if we have,
along
capacity
those
to do
same
so.
lines, I have another suggestion too, which is academia.edu.
Sure.
Yes,
Yeah.
which is a place I use it a lot where academics in any kind of discipline can upload your own works. And so you can go on there and it's tagged in all kinds of ways. You can search for what you're interested in and you can see what Amy Margaris upload. I always upload my own papers there and anybody can access that stuff for free.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank
Cool.
you.
So to sum up, LibGen, libraries, academia.edu, and email the person who wrote the article and ask them politely.
Yeah.
Sci-Hub.
Sci-Hub, yes,
Sci-Hub,
absolutely.
yeah. It's been a lifesaver.
I know, right?
Right?
So this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm glad to have you guys participate, and I want to give you a chance to sum up what's the biggest takeaway from tonight for each of you. Starting with Paul Edward.
Ooh. So yeah, I think the biggest sum up is that all of us, people come to thinking about ancient astronauts and these kinds of pseudo-archaeologies, not because they're bad players. Yeah, I mean, pseudo-archaeology, ancient astronauts, all of that kind of inevitably boils down to racism. But nobody, I don't want to say nobody, but most people don't come to think about this and go yeah, I'm a racist, so of course I have to think this. People are curious. And sometimes the way that we approach these topics is based on our mileage, based on what we have access to, based on our own understandings of the world. And so we all kind of have to come together and have conversations with each other in that understanding that we all have different worldviews, we all have different understandings, and that if we can find the right ways to talk to each other, we can have a constructive conversation instead of me, maybe looking at someone and saying, oh, well, you're a jackass for thinking that. That doesn't help anyone. It might make me feel good for a second, but it didn't help. So just finding the ways to have constructive conversations is everything in the world to our understanding of the wonkiness that is the human story.
And Amy?
Oh gosh, I would good luck following that. Yeah, I know,
Sorry.
right? I would echo all of that. Y'all are here, those of you who are listening, because presumably you like archaeology.
Yeah.
So we all like archaeology. There doesn't have to be this big divide, Read Sapiens, ask questions of other people and yourselves, and we don't know all the answers, but we gotta just keep searching. You can't just make assumptions, you gotta keep searching.
All right.
Follow the evidence.
And Beth?
I would say more than anything, being open-minded about the things that you read and see, and if something seems like it's, too good to be true, or how, in the case of ancient aliens, how are people making these connections? You don't have to be an academic or a professional archaeologist or specialist to do some very basic searching and ask those questions for yourself. You can arrive at those conclusions. And understanding that science is never monolithic, is never the only way, is never the final right answer, right? That we continue to change our minds, we change our interpretations, and we ourselves are open-minded. So I think that would be my big takeaway. Be open-minded about the world out there. It's an amazing place. And go to Serpent Mound.
It is a beautiful site. Well, thank you so much for spending the evening with us here, and thank you to the panelists, and thank you to the Happy Dog. Please treat your bartenders well, because they have been treating you well all night. And that concludes this panel discussion. Thank you.
And thank you, Julie, for organizing this and having us here. Thank you. It's really fun.